might we start with your childhood years? And did you aspire
Goodness.
to become a doctor from a very early age or not at all?
No, not particularly. I thought I was going to be an engineer. I was always interested in very mechanical things. I'm still interested in steam trains, and did stuff with my hands. And I was all set up to do engineering, and I was going to be try and do engineering at Cambridge. So I did double maths A level and physics, and was lining up to do what was called the MSQE, the Mechanical Sciences Qualifying Exam. It's a little bit narrow. The reason I took that route was because the maths teachers at school were so good. I wanted to be with them. It wasn't anything more logical than that. Anyway, I got my A-levels and suddenly thought for the first time, do I really want to do this? In a rather rapid progression of about 6 weeks, I kind of dropped engineering. I looked at my father. My father was in the Navy. I thought of being a naval engineer, and then I thought, no, I want to be on the bridge, executive. And then I thought, do I really want to be in the Navy? A declining profession as far as I could see, as we had peace. So my mother's a nurse, and she, for the first time, said, what about medicine? I thought that sounded a good idea. But then I had to do different A-levels. I had the wrong A-levels. So to my subsequent disappointment, I didn't do a gap year. I did more A-levels. I did chemistry and physics and biology. No, I'd done physics. I did biology. Biology was the big introduction. And I got a place at Cambridge on interview and went up there. And Cambridge wasn't very good from a medical point of view. It was fine from a cultural point of view. Wonderful. But I was at Trinity, and Trinity wanted Nobel Prize-winning physiologists, which I clearly wasn't. And it really wasn't, I didn't start to kind of learn anything till I got St. Thomas's. And then St. Thomas's was my clinical school. And it really wasn't at its best in the 60s. It was very laissez-faire. We had no exams. We had no feedback. We had no idea how we were doing. The one thing I learned was that I did not want to be a GP, because they said only fools go into general practice. And they also said, you've got to register with a GP, but don't go to him. You come to us if you want care. So, I mean, they were putting down general practice big time. And while I was there, they appointed their first director, not yet a professor. I think it was David Morrell, wonderful man. Later got to know him well. Well, he gave us one lecture in my course, and it was made general practice so impossible, so wonderful. I thought, it's off the wall. I mean, nothing's like that. That's not real. It's another world. Nothing to do with me. So I wasn't going to be a GP. So then I was going to be a physician, not a surgeon. I thought looking inside bodies was very interesting, but I didn't like all the sewing up. It took forever. So physician. So I did MRCP, and I was in Wessex. I was very lucky. I got a job in Southampton and then at the Wessex Neurological Centre, which was a fantastic clinical teaching role as an SHO. And to my surprise, and to other people's surprise as well, I passed both parts of MRCP first time. So suddenly, I was in the middle of a 1-year SHO job, having passed. And I went to my boss, a neurosurgeon, and said, he said, what are you going to do now? I said, well, I'll look for, I'll think about what I'm going to do next. He said, you won't. He said, you've got to leave. This is a training job. You're trained. Go. I mean, you couldn't do that nowadays, but this was 1971. And but he said, what are you going to do? Which specialty do you like? I said, I like them all. They're all interesting. I don't know what I'm going to do. And he said, have you thought of general practice? And I said, yes, and I thought not. Oh, he said, I think you might like it. And then he said the real killer thing. He said, it's too difficult for me. He said, I couldn't do it. Too much uncertainty. I just couldn't do it. But I think I've watched you. You might like it. You should try it. And if you don't like it, I will find you another job. Well, I went for it. And it just so happened that this was in Southampton, just as the new medical school was starting. So he said, go and see John Forbes, the new director of the new general practice unit. So I went to see John Forbes, and he offered me a traineeship in the new academic general practice that they were setting up. soon as I got into general practice, I thought, why hasn't anyone told me about this before? Because I never did any as a student. We had no attachments at St Thomas's in the 60s, nothing. So I was there enjoying being a fledgling GP, and there was a job going in the department, which I applied for and got. And then I was a lecturer in primary care. Well, it was originally called community medicine, but we broke away from the Department of Epidemiology, headed by the foundation dean, wonderful man, Donald Atterson. He was later chief medical officer at the time of the AIDS epidemic. He was a real special man. And the thing about Southampton was it did more general practice than other schools. So we at least had a department and some money. And when it came to looking above the parapet and looking around all over the country, we turned out to be one of the largest departments, like 4 people. So that's how it was. So I started by accident and liked it and had to learn on the job, and nobody knew what they were doing. And there was no research.
It sounds like you had that academic clinical balance, albeit informally, from the start. Would you say that?
Yes, I felt very guilty about it. Other GPs said, you're not a proper GP, you aren't doing it enough. And I felt really bad about that for some years, but I think I learned eventually. Never did more than about 60% clinical.
Okay. How did that acceptance come then? When you say you learned eventually, what do you mean?
Well, because I gradually, 2 things happened. One was I gradually started to believe in myself because, the actual experience of being a young GP was incredible, really. It was really difficult. I mean, all this stuff, and you read about this in every text about our discipline. It's so different from hospital. And all these people coming with things you've never heard of, and you don't know what to do. I mean, one seminal moment was on a Saturday afternoon when there was this young man with chest pain. And I thought, oh my goodness, he's got a coronary. And there he was, looking sweaty and pale and all this sort of stuff. Well, it was an overbreathing attack. Did I know about overbreathing attacks? No, I didn't. I'd never heard of them. But I noticed that as I examined him, he calmed down. And by the time I'd finished, and we'd been talking a bit, his pain had gone. And I thought, I don't think it is a coronary. Really, he's got better too quickly. It's too easy. And then I read about them, So it was that crazy, really. And then a big influence was the work of Michael Balint, the doctor, the patient, and the illness. That was amazing. That explains so much about why patients were in front of me. So I rather slowly got to the crucial question in general practice: why has this patient come, and why have they come now? So, as an academic GP, I did become a real general practitioner, interested in problems that real general practitioners have as clinicians, and to try and make it better.
And how do you think your patients would have described you as a practicing GP? Are there any particular characteristics that you sort of aspired to embody, for example? Or
I don't think so. I don't think there were. I was just trying to be a good doctor, whatever that was. And the role models around me were more senior academic GPs. There were 2 or 3 in the practice. They were all experienced in what you might call real general practice before they came in. I wasn't, but they were. And I gradually caught up with them, I think. And then there was the problem of teaching. I said we weren't doing any research, but we were doing teaching, and we were devising the curriculum. And there I was in a little group with the chairman of the local medical committee looking at me for guidance about how to teach. And I didn't know what I was teaching. So there we were. It was the blind leading the blind. But we learned quite fast, and it was very, very exciting. And several things happened. One was that John Howey came to give a talk to the Southampton Medical Society, which was a largely, it was supposed to be consultants and GPs, but it was largely GPs. And the question of whether to give an antibiotic for sore throat was then a very open question. And he got evidence about it. And that was so exciting. And he came and he stayed the night in Southampton, and he came to my teaching session the next day and sat in on that. And this was about 1973, 74. I'd been in the job 2 or 3 years. And to meet this man was quite amazing. And I'm still friends with him now. He's still alive, you know. You ought to interview him, if you'll agree. So that was one thing, made a big impression. And my first research project was what I called a sore throat trial, to see about giving antibiotics for sore throat. And we were doing age-specific care. It was a crazy project, and it never worked. And I learned that this was a crazy thing to do in general practice. It was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and it was to last several years, and it was to see whether we could mount care for adults, for children, and for the elderly, and that we would each be better at those than we would be if we tried to do everything. And I had MRCP. I was a mediatrician. I wasn't a pediatrician, and I wasn't a geriatrician. And of course, every time anyone went on holiday, it all went to pieces. And there were all kinds of silly things, like the geriatrician twiddled his thumbs at 8:30 in the morning because his elderly patients didn't like to come in before 10. Their free bus passes didn't work, and he could have been seeing kids all this time, you know, all those kind of things. So we abandoned it. But in the process, I had learnt that seeing the same doctor might be important. And because one of the things we had to do was hand over patients at the age of 65 to one's colleague, the geriatrician. I didn't like doing that. I found I didn't like doing it. And I got interested in this question of, did it matter whether you saw the same doctor? This was also accelerated by the fact that we were all part-time, as we discussed earlier. And so we weren't giving very good personal continuity of care. And again, wondered if it mattered. Well, I started supervising research projects for students. And a very bright student came along. And I wasn't very confident, but I didn't know what to do with him the first morning. And I sat him in reception. And he came back afterwards. He said, I'm very unimpressed with your practice. He said that patients came to the receptionist to rebook and they didn't know the name of the doctor they'd just seen. Isn't that disgraceful? And I said, I felt criticised. I felt on the spot. I said, I don't think it matters that much. Can we prove it? And so actually, we tried to prove it. And we set up a compliance study. And basically, he went and visited every patient that had had a new prescription for an antibiotic. He visited them a week later. Didn't matter what it was for. He found out whether they'd taken it. And he also found out whether they felt they knew their doctor. And he found a very strong correlation. Really, it was quite surprising. And, well, that was my first paper in the BMJ. And I got a congratulatory letter from John Horder, who was then president of the RCGP. And more importantly, perhaps, I got one from Julian Tudor Hart, the independent communist, wonderful thinker who described the inverse care law in South Wales in his fastness in Glencorrog, the colliery practice Upper Valley. So I got a note from him congratulating me about proving the obvious or something. So that it was becoming clear 10 years on. I'd been promoted to senior lecturer with one paper to my name. I mean, just imagine the world we were in. That's what it was like. But I needed to get real and get research experience. I needed a doctorate. I needed to learn. And continuity of care seemed to be needing research. It was a question that was interesting to me and to other people. And that's how I got started on it. And I was very, very lucky that at that time we were being advised about practice dynamics and departmental dynamics and interpersonal behavior by David Pendleton, who was a sociologist, psychologist and sociologist interested in interpersonal behavior. And later, of course, as we know, in doctor-patient communication. But John Bain, our professor, suggested that he be my mentor. And I think other people on this series have said about the importance of mentors. Really, David Pendleton was my first and most wonderful mentor. And he guided me through a series of studies to eventually get an MD from my old university, Cambridge, in continuity of care in general practice. And that took about 10 years. But that's how I learned research, doing studies with help. Mm-hmm. And not only from him, but from other people. I mean, there was a wonderful statistician in Southampton at the epidemiology department, Clive Osmond, fantastic guy. So I'm very grateful to the people who've helped me over the years.
Mm. And I mean, the way that you present how you got into continuity of care really suggests that you're almost a founding member of that concept, and or at least the recognition of that concept. And it's often deemed quite a fluffy, quite intangible, complicated thing. How much of a barrier do you think that inconsistency in its definition is in practice and policy terms, if we're thinking about, current day?
I started by kind of describing the field. I looked at all the papers that were available, and of course then it was all hand searching and enlisting librarians to help you and getting reprints on paper from other libraries and all this sort of stuff. So it took quite a long time, but there wasn't very much. And a lot of the evidence came from the USA. And Barbara Starfield was already a name that everybody knew, and she was already talking about continuity of care. And they had already formulated definitions, and we had the usual provider continuity measure already in place. So what David Pendleton was so good at was helping me see the role of continuity from the patient's point of view. I had been totally professionally centered about doctors, and I started to see it the other way around. So my research consisted of asking patients about the appointment they'd just had, and had they seen the doctor they wanted to see, and did it matter, and who would they see next time, those kind of things. That was very interesting. We started just by counting the number of consultations with the same doctor there were, and we had to do that before computers by looking at handwriting, looking at notes and going back and analysing handwriting to say how many different doctors we'd seen. So that was how we began. And the most interesting study was a study watching receptionists make appointments. And my excellent research colleague, Sally Richards, sat in reception of these 4 practices I was looking at and observed patients interacting with receptionists. They interacted across the counter and, of course, on the telephone. But she could gather a lot of a telephone conversation from only hearing one half and occasionally just asking the receptionist, "Oh, what did you mean then?" And she got a whole lot of data about whether people saw the person they wanted to see, or whether they saw them at the time they wanted to see, or whether they saw someone else at the time they wanted to see. And she then interviewed the receptionists. Having got all the data, she interviewed the receptionists and found that the attitude of the receptionists to the importance of seeing the same doctor made a real difference to the appointments that were made. That was maybe my best paper. Very simple. And that was the level of research we were doing. It was like not quite back of the envelope, but not a lot further advanced. But it was groundbreaking at the time.
It stands the test of time as well, and it's almost come back around, the importance of attitudes, and particularly for, like you say, administrative staff. And we could talk about continuity for probably about a year and a half continuously, but you've contributed to multiple documents and things produced through the Royal College of General Practitioners. What do you consider the role of the college to be? And in your opinion, has this changed over recent decades, or has it needed to change?
Well, my relationship with the college has actually never been very close. We started off in my department in Southampton being discouraged from joining the college. It was like my professor of the time, who was, set us all up and got the building and money and all kinds of things. He wanted nothing to do with the college. I don't know why, but he didn't. And then suddenly one day, there was a change of heart. I was been in my post as a lecturer about 4 years by this time. He said, "Oh, I think you better join the college, George. You better do the exam." So I did the exam, and I passed. But, you know, it was a close-run thing, I gather. And I think I was rather rude at one of the interviews because I was arrogant. I was an arrogant young academic who thought I knew the answers. But anyway, I passed. And we had a little more to do with the college after that. And my impression was that the college was pretty important, actually. I mean, before this rather negative phase, while I was a trainee in 1971, I went to the first ever national trainee conference, which was in Newcastle. And all the big dignitaries of general practice were there. That was a wake-up call to me. That was the first time I appreciated general practice as a discipline. So that was down to the college that happened. And also, I went on a day release course, and it was run by George Swift, who was a local GP in Winchester. He had set up the first GP training scheme in England. The first one in the UK was in Scotland, in Inverness, but he set up the first one in England. And this was so much better than the MRCP course I'd been on the year before. He did all the quality control himself, and it was fascinating. So that was all about the college. And that leads me on to this terrible divide that we have between postgraduate education, which is not run by university departments. It's under the aegis of universities, but it's postgraduate, it's completely separate, which doesn't happen in any other country, and it's really bad for our discipline. I want to say that here. So, but we, for a lot of the time, although the college wanted to help undergraduate departments, we had rather little to do with them. And we started to have real priorities in trying to get power and influence, really, money in universities, because it was an uphill struggle all the time. The hospital colleagues didn't want much to do with us, and they didn't want to give us time in the curriculum, and they didn't want to give us jobs and money because it would take away from them. So it was always a battle, and the college wasn't a lot of help with this. And there, you know, you could talk for an hour and a half. You've talked about a year and a half about that. It was quite an interesting journey. But basically, I've interacted with the college intermittently over the years, and I'm very proud of the college. But I still think it could do more, actually. And that's partly down to us and partly down to them. And we are actively at the moment trying to cultivate better relationships.
And perhaps to come back to continuity, because we can't leave it alone for long, and sort of tie things up. Are you optimistic or disheartened if you think about the future of general practice in relation to continuity?
I think we're in a bad place. I think we're in the worst place we've been since I was a student in 1965-66, a clinical student, when general practice seemed to have very low morale. And my GP at home, this was another factor in my career choice, he said, "George, don't go into general practice. It's awful." And then, of course, we had the GP Charter. And they introduced basic practice allowance and group practice allowances and loans for premises and all kinds of improvements. And the really crucial thing was 70% reimbursement of 2 members of ancillary staff for every GP. So previously it had meant if you employed a receptionist, you took home less money. And now that you only took home 30% less money, which made it much different. And so that was a huge thing, and it led to a sort of 25-year period of great expansion and optimism in our discipline. Now we're in a bad place again. And I think the trouble is now the country's in such a bad place economically that the sort of financial injection that was introduced in 1968, hard to see it happening now. But basically I see general practice as starved of funds. It means we can't do the job. It means access has collapsed. That means continuity has collapsed. And because the two are so intertwined. And yes, morale is very bad. I remain optimistic and hopeful. I think there are green shoots of GPs starting to realise that actually if we don't do continuity, we are completely sunk. It actually does lighten the workload after an initial investment. And I think there are grounds for hope. But it's a hard road ahead.
Well, I'm glad that we can end on at least a semi-positive note. And yes, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your perspective and experience.